everyone enjoys. To start off, I'll just do a little bit of a brief introduction about sort of who we are and, what Little Fox does. So basically, we're a small design studio. I run it with my partner here, who's going to be contributing to the webinar as well. And we focus on really working with ideally eco-friendly clients that have the same values as us to produce sustainable, environmentally friendly design. And we found that through the process of learning about design, it's actually been really incredible for our business. We've been able to grow. We've been able to have clients that we care so much more about than previously. Not that our clients before weren't great, but it's so cool to be able to have a strong values alignment with our clients about the environment and about doing good in the world. We're carbon neutral as a studio, and most of our work really focuses on building out branding, packaging, and web design for our clients. So usually our ideal client and the kind of inquiry that we get most frequently is clients that are really looking for that full package. They have usually been in business at least 1 or 2 years, and they're really looking for a rebrand, a full visual identity refresh. They want consulting and help navigating the world of sustainable packaging, because it can actually be quite a hard world to navigate. And it is really detailed and nuanced, and they find it quite confusing. And so we're here to help with that, as well as actually do the design for the packaging. And then, of course, building out, usually for e-commerce clients, a Shopify site or Squarespace for our service-based clients. And in that way, we try and make everything as sustainable as possible, and to be able to really offer that guidance to our clients about being as eco-friendly as possible. So my name is Emma, and I focus more on the design side. And I started the journey into sustainable, I would say, like in 2016, when news about climate crisis started coming out, and I started getting more and more anxious about it. And I was searching for a way of integrating my own lifestyle values with going low waste and trying to reduce, meat and plastic with my design studio. And I wasn't sure that anyone would really care. And, now in 2021, turns out a lot of people care, and there's a lot of amazing designers like you that also care. So a lot of what we focus on is just increasing accessibility for the information that we had a pretty hard time finding. And I'll let you do a little introduction for yourself.
Hi, I'm Emma's partner, Saston. During the start of Corona, basically with academics kind of taking a pause since online courses were generally awful, I decided to spend more time working with Emma on Little Fox, particularly when she was motivated to start the green graphic design course in late 2020.
Late 2020.
And quickly realized that was a lot more work than she anticipated. So we kind of collaborated on getting that built up.
Mm-hmm.
And basically my background is like STEM heavy. So generally I focus a lot on technical details of packaging, like life cycle analysis, being able to read kind of dense chemistry or like math heavy academic papers to be able to understand like the fundamentals of what is most sustainable, and also to kind of like spot out greenwashing when present. That's really my area where I contribute the most for client side of things. I also sometimes do copywriting. Whenever you see like a particularly flashy email, it's usually me.
It wasn't me, for sure. Any nice emails that go out are always him. So the course that you mentioned, we'll talk about this really briefly here and a little bit more at the end, because ultimately we want this to be informative. We've put together a course that really teaches you everything that we've learned about green design over the last 3 years or so, and our firsthand experiences. We're working to build a community because we really think that all designers should be green. And it would be our great joy if we could drop any kind of like sustainable or green title from the work that we do, because it's so commonplace in the industry. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. We'll jump right into the webinar. So I really like to start off most of the webinars about green design talking about the difference in my perception of what my role is as a designer was. Because when I first started, I mean, granted, I'm self-taught, so maybe some of this is just from my own, baby beginnings. But when I started, I sort of, a client would come to me, they would request some piece of design work. I would do the design, I'd send it to the printer. Sometimes I would talk with the printer to be like, oh, what do you think would be best? There was never any real consideration about the environment or like paper stocks or nothing beyond like, oh, the client wants a luxurious business card, so it should be thicker, or like, oh, this needs to be like, this is a wall label like vinyl that has to be waterproof or something. And then the thing would get created. It was very exciting. There would be an end result, and I didn't think about it ever again. I didn't think about what happened to it. I didn't think about like where it was going to end up at the end of its life, and that was just sort of like the full extent of what I was familiar with as a designer. I really wasn't considering any kind of externalities or other considerations that are, these choices are being made whether or not you're making an active choice for them. So this is sort of my expanded supply chain designer responsibility chart that is now more in line with the things that we are making decisions about, or at least talking and researching printers and different supply chains about. So there's natural resource responsibility. This can include forestry practices, how the paper is manufactured, and transportation. This is also relevant in case you're using a bioplastic or anything that's coming from any sort of like actual resource in the ground. It's really important to understand the process and how that resource was actually obtained before it becomes something that you're familiar with, like paper or plastic. And on the printer side, there's production responsibility. So this can include the kinds of materials used, the kinds of print shop protocols, print specifications, printing method. All of those kinds of things can play into the environmental impact of the project. And it's really important to be able to consider these things and make decisions about it. And finally, the end portion is just life cycle responsibility. The way that we make choices and design for all of these different aspects will impact where the thing is going to end up at the end of the day. So, if you can choose 100% recycled paper that has very few coatings, it's got plant-based ink, there is a higher chance that that paper is then going to be recycled at the end of its life, giving it new life again. But if you design something that's on virgin paper, it's going to be coming from potentially an unsustainably forested piece of land. If you put a lot of coatings on it, like spot UV, laminates, those are all plastic based and can impact the potential of whether or not that thing is going to be recycled. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about in my portion of the webinar is really going to be focused on paper, and then Sastra is going to take over and talk a little bit more about more complex materials like glass, aluminum, and plastics. We'll end on some resources and exciting future trends, and then that will close out the webinar. So some of the three main areas that the designers can have impact on are environmental impact, human impact, and printing impact. For packaging, the environmental impact really comes in the form of the kinds of materials that you're choosing. If you're choosing paper, is it coming from a sustainable source? If you are choosing plastic, understanding that the plastic is coming from a process of oil extraction that is contributing to climate crisis, and understanding how to navigate when you need to choose a plastic. Human impact comes in the form of usually the production of the paper or the material being used. So frequently that can be if a paper mill has unsustainable practices or isn't correctly following environmental regulation, then they can actually, for example, Domtar paper is, they didn't properly treat some of the effluent coming out of one of their paper mills for, I think it was like around a year or so. And they ended up being dinged by the EPA for a Superfund cleanup for the entire area because it caused so much harm and toxins to go into the water that it was killing fish, it was hurting people's health, and it was quite a serious concern. So when companies slip up or choose not to properly manage toxic waste that comes out of any kind of process of creating a material, then there can be environmental repercussions for that. Human impact also comes in the form of things like plastics. In areas where chemical plants that create the plastics or incinerate the plastics are housed, those areas are usually low income. They're usually Black or Latino or Indigenous. And so these areas, if you live in one of the cities, it's not even a city, if you live in one of those rural areas where a chemical plant is in the United States or Canada, your chance of getting cancer can be up to 50 times higher than the normal rate of getting cancer, just because it is so harmful to live near these facilities. And printing impact comes really in the form of the kinds of inks that you use. It can come in the form of how many coatings or layers does your product have. So for paper, are you, again, putting spot UV coatings or laminate coatings on it? Or for plastics, how much plastic is being used? Is there a way to lightweight the plastic so that ultimately less plastic is ending up in the environment? Packaging is really important because it can be an amazing way of building trust with consumers. Consumers are looking for sustainability, and they're looking for transparency, and they're looking for brands to do more than just, say that they're eco-friendly. They're looking for action, and they're looking for statements and responsibility and true transparency about their processes. And packaging can be an amazing way to bridge that gap with the consumer and be able to educate them about the company's benefits, and to be able to increase the consumer's likelihood of feeling good about their purchase and choosing, potentially your client over their competitor just based on the environmental sustainability. Buying power and the power of sustainability is only increasing as generations get younger and come into more financial ability to spend in the economy. So currently, I believe it's around 75% of millennials globally are interested in purchasing from sustainably or ethically oriented clients, brands. And it's really becoming more important. It's even higher with Gen Z. So this is something really important to consider and discuss with our clients, is that they can actually increase their market share by choosing sustainable packaging. Ultimately, the physical designs and materials that we create have a life before that we create them and after we create them. And this is really sort of the fundamental principle behind my definition of green design, is just really being able to consider where the material is coming from, how it's made, and what's going to happen to it after you're done designing it. Because the things that we create do have a life outside of our Illustrator artboards or our InDesign artboards, and so it's really important to consider that. Most of the things that we create as designers are unfortunately likely to be landfilled, and so it's about designing and trying to ensure that it will be recycled. Ultimately, people don't really reuse packaging unless it's a special refill program where you're using the refill for the same or very similar use, and people don't really recycle properly. So it's important to take this into consideration and be designing for the most likely end case scenario instead of wish cycling or making an assumption that consumers at large are going to be more inclined to take pieces apart and properly clean and recycle. Some of the main supply chain certifications that you can look for, especially when choosing paper, are the Forest Stewardship Council, the Ancient Forest Alliance, and the Rainforest Alliance Group. So the Forest Stewardship Council is a global supply chain certification for forestry. It's ensuring that basically forests are protected, especially endangered forests, and that the logging rate in those areas is sustainable and is something that is actually renewable. They also consider biodiversity. They consider the health and safety of the workers, and they also are considering Indigenous peoples and giving them requiring informed consent for everything that's going on. Ancient Forest Friendly is kind of a subset of that, where it's really considering the fact that some really, really old endangered ancient forests, like trees that are 100 to 10,000 years old, those are still being logged actively, and that if this certification stamp is there, then it did not come from an ancient and endangered forest, because those forests are incredibly important for carbon sinks, fighting against climate change, as well as rare ecosystems and species that we don't even know about. And the Rainforest Alliance is really specifically focusing on, the Amazon rainforest and ensuring that the paper has not been basically just clear cut to grow agricultural cows, support the beef industrial complex,
Do you want some water real quick?
I do want some water. It is very hot here today in Canada. Thank you. So Green E certification means that the paper is going to be made with renewable resources, usually wind or solar. That's a very cool certification to look for. You can also look for totally chlorine-free paper. What this means is that the paper, in the process of bleaching it, didn't use chlorine, which is a very toxic chemical, which is one of the ones that can cause dead zones when it is not properly treated, and is one of the reasons why Domtar was responsible for the Superfund cleanup. You can also look for printing with soy-based ink, which is a way of choosing plant-based inks. It doesn't necessarily have to be soy, but it's going to be shifting away from petroleum-based inks and having a sustainable alternative. Other alternative paper fibers that you can look for include hemp. 100% post-consumer waste recycled paper is pretty much your best bet, and usually one of the cheapest if your client is budget conscious. There's paper made of straw, cotton, stone, and seed. The printer and paper recommendations, those links, highly recommend checking them out. They talk about printers in North America and paper stocks globally that have strong environmental policies and strong environmental methods of creating them. We're just going to talk quickly through some of the coolest, in my opinion, alternative fibers that you can get paper on. So these are all from Mohawk Renewal line, which I'm not sponsored. I just love them. And so basically this paper is made of reclaimed straw. So in farmers' fields, usually the straw at the end of the harvest season is burned, which is obviously creating more CO2 emissions. Instead of burning it, Mohawk has created a partnership with a paper mill that reclaims this straw and turns it into the beautiful paper that you see there. So it's naturally dyed. It is incredibly appropriate for packaging, especially because it can come in some quite thick stocks, and it is just quite amazing. So this paper, wheat rough, is 30% wheat, and the rest of it is Forest Stewardship Council certified paper. They usually blend the papers, some of these special ones, just to give them a little bit more sturdiness, but it's still ultimately reducing the amount of pressure on forests, which is really cool. Another stock that they have, which I am so desperate to use in a client project one day, is paper made out of hemp. Again, naturally dyed. Hemp is awesome because it has a 90-day growing cycle instead of like around 30 years for traditional lumber. It's extremely high quality. It's appropriate for packaging because it is very durable and has a really low water and energy cost to create, which is really fantastic. Hemp is so renewable, and it has the ability to be so appropriate for clothing, plastics, and paper that it's really cool that recently this is now legal in the market to be able to actually create. So really excited about that. Looking forward to how that grows. And then the last thing is, this is 100% recycled cotton paper, so no traditional fibers here, and it's actually made out of recycled jeans and t-shirts. So the blue paper is entirely made out of jeans, and the white one is more so made out of t-shirts. Again, no dyes are used. It's really sustainable, and it's diverting fabric from the landfill, which is actually quite a serious problem. Especially with the rise of fast fashion. So this can be a really fun stock to use that is also super sustainable. And now I will transition over to Sastin.
Okay, so this section is broken up into two parts, hard materials and then films. Reason why it's broken up in that way is because a lot of the use cases for these different things are highly specific. Oh yeah, maybe we should bring the microphone up. The use cases for hard materials, which in this case I'm talking about glass, aluminum, and steel, which are generally the main packaging materials that you'll find are being used in that kind of context of wanting to have like a rigid exterior. With the exception of like HDPE, which is like, what does it stand for again? High density polyethylene. Yeah, polyethylene, which is used for like milk cartons or milk jugs and things like that. But that's usually very specific to a certain kinds of very specific kinds of packaging. So I'm going to be breaking up these discussions of these different materials into kind of four general discussion points, which is the sustainable advantages of the material, the sustainable disadvantages of the material, the sustainability goals, so kind of aspirationally what we should kind of like aspire to with that material, like what can be done to make it more sustainable than where it currently is. And finally, the functional qualities of it. So what are the use cases where it's relevant to consider for different projects, and what kind of material properties it has in terms of what kind of products should be housed in it, and just kind of various things like that. So yeah, so start with glass. Everyone's pretty familiar with glass, I imagine. Uh, Obviously, glass is so being main advantage of sustainable advantage of glass is that it's highly recyclable. In fact, it's 100% recyclable. And what that means is that glass, when recycled, has essentially infinite recyclability. So it can be recycled, put into new glass material, and that new glass can then be recycled again and again and again and again with no loss in quality. There are some caveats to that in terms of glass. You might kind of remember abstractly that you sometimes see amber glass and green glass and clear glass and sometimes very uniquely blue glass. And these different kind of colors are determined by different chemical compositions in the manufacturing process. And so the reason why you sometimes see kind of like divisions of different glass types is because you can't, if you have too much of a weird mix of different glass types, you won't be able to generate the same kind of initial glass quality. So you can't make amber glass out of a bunch of green glass and clear glass and all these other mixed things. It has to be purely made out of more amber glass going back into an amber production line. And so that's one of the reasons why like infrastructure is somewhat limited for that sort of thing, because people don't like sorting their glass. So some of these things could be done a lot better than they currently are, in the context of a lot of glass that's recycled. It doesn't get recycled with the intent of like going into appropriate, like highly specific, like green glass to green glass flows, blue glass to blue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like a morass of glass. And so sometimes recycled glass is a lower quality, but it doesn't have to be. And it's really just a kind of a gap in the infrastructure that's around, where we don't take the time to kind of properly sort these things. And that's really kind of unfortunate, in part because when recycled glass is put into the production of new glass, it actually decreases the amount of energy that's required to make the new glass in the first place. So, for example, I forget the exact numbers, but I think it's as much as like 70 to 80% of the energy cost going into the production of new glass can be cut when you have a significant amount of recycled glass going in as a feedstock. And that's because you need less energy to melt it down than the kind of the raw substituent materials that go into production of new glass. This is also important that we kind of like make the manufacturing and reuse of glass kind of like more commonplace, since as the raw materials that go into glass are generally quite common. The main limiting factor is the grade of sand that goes into the production. So this is one example where this was kind of like a news story that didn't really make much waves early on during the pandemic, where there was concerns over the limitations of extremely high fine quality sand in use for medical grade glass. And the reason why that was concerned is because that particular like fine grit sand is only available in a few parts of the world, and its other major demand is for tar sands fracking. Because it has such a fine grit that it's very useful for that kind of for certain industry practices. And that's and that it's actually like a very limited quantity of that sand. And of course, sand isn't renewable resource, or it is, but it takes hundreds of thousands of millions of years. So under any reasonable like assessment, we are going through it at a much more rapid pace than is being renewed by natural processes. So generally, like glass is a very sustainable material compared to a lot of other options, but there needs to be better infrastructure in place to ensure that it is put into as much of a closed loop as possible in its production and reuse. Other advantages of glass is that people kind of like glass, and if you have packaging that is designed with the intent of someone being able to reuse the glass container for kind of like reasonable household uses, so things like mason jars where no one can have too many mason jars, containers that can actually be used to efficiently store like normal household goods. It's not meant to like kind of one of those things where it's very hard to find a secondary storage purpose for a cosmetic glass container because it's so short and squat. But like a larger glass jar, yeah, sure, people can find a lot of the time uses for those sorts of containers. Let's see, the main kind of sustainable disadvantages of glass are, well, really fundamentally is just the weight. Beyond the extraction, which because a lot of it is mining based, has its downsides. The transport of glass containers is the largest carbon footprint of the material. And that's kind of like a hard thing to get away from. Like there are limits to how much lightweighting you can do with glass before it becomes very, very fragile and will just like become unusable as a packaging material. But when you kind of have the option of being able to request or kind of navigate with suppliers to have as lightweight as glass possible while still maintaining like enough structural integrity, that is like an ideal thing to do. Since even reducing the weight by 10% takes a huge cut off of the overall like carbon footprint of that glass packaging. And there are definitely advantages to using glass in terms of like perceptions of quality. It has an extremely good moisture barrier. Like you're not getting any water through a centimeter of glass. It's just not happening. It is of course transparent, which also has like kind of elegant elements to it. People like being able to see products through glass. It can have kind of aesthetic properties. And it also, for certain kinds of goods, is actually very, very essential. So pharmaceuticals, where you can have certain pharmaceuticals in plastic, plastic, and particularly for like various oil-based like pharmaceuticals or cosmetics, plastic can be reactive with those materials, whereas glass is essentially chemically inert. You're not going to find glass like interacting with any kind of substance you put inside it in any kind of realistic way. If anyone is kind of remembering like high school chemistry, there's a reason why every kind of container you're using is glass, because it is so inert compared to pretty much any other material that you could use, which makes it really, really useful for products where it's really, really important that it does not change through like interactions with other things. So when you're dealing with particularly with supplements or like important essential oils, things like that, glass is basically the only viable kind of container to house these things in. And additionally, the best glass to use in those cases is amber, since it has the best UV protection of all kind of glass types. Like green and blue is like are okay, but sorry, I love glass.
I know.
And anyway, since this is a long, glass is one of the ones that I like the most. Moving on, aluminum. Once again, everyone's very familiar, highly recyclable. There's a lot of existing infrastructure that allows the recycling of aluminum, and that's something we always have to consider is even if something is technically recyclable, is there existing infrastructure that supplies like viable routes for a consumer who's gotten the packaging to actually recycle it? Because even if something is technically recyclable, if there's no way for a consumer to easily take the packaging and know where to take it and take it to that production line, it's just not going to happen. So using aluminum kind of gets around that, because if it goes into can recycling, it can be easily included in their processes of recycling. There's also kind of like various policies that are in place in certain areas that encourage aluminum recycling, so such as deposits. There's always kind of controversy where a lot of soft drink manufacturers actively lobby against the development of like deposit programs because they fear that it will kind of impact their sales. But it's the sort of thing that can readily be implemented through kind of like community like lobbying and just like, cities taking the initiative on trying to reduce kind of the negative impact of the raw extraction of aluminum, when you could just like, you have cans lying around, you could just recycle those again. Oftentimes, because it is a little bit more reactive than glass, you will find that there is sometimes plastic incorporated into aluminum cans, particularly since, for example, soft drinks sometimes are acidic enough that there needs to be a coating that prevents the aluminum from like degrading. This, however, is kind of like accounted for in the recycling process, and they're very, very efficient at like removing like the aluminum itself and putting it through the recycling process like effectively. The reason why you also have aluminum cans, and this is kind of an interesting aside, like why don't you see like you know how you have anyway. This is kind of like a really weird aside, but you ever notice how plastic water bottles can be that really shitty, like crinkly plastic that you can just kind of like crush like very casually, but you don't really see any soda bottles like that? It's because soda bottles are under high pressure because of the carbonation, whereas like not very high quality water bottles don't have to have the same kind of rigidity to kind of prevent them from just like exploding. Just fun little factoid. Yeah, that's kind of the main things to talk about for aluminum. Obviously, there's extraction that goes on with the production of new aluminum, but because it is, just as glass was, 100% renewable, 100% recyclable, really the aspirational goal for aluminum is to make it make the infrastructure that supports this recycling is like pervasive and like easy for consumers to access as possible.
I have a small chime in. Aluminum can also be really fantastic for cosmetics packaging. Anything that's in sort of like a squeeze tube that's traditionally plastic, things like toothpaste or conditioners or shampoos can be put in aluminum roll-up tubes that are entirely recyclable, which is really cool and something that is becoming a little bit more common.
Yeah, and I will add that even if like plastic needs to be used in like some of aluminum packaging for the sake of having that barrier component, that is advantageous over being entirely plastic, in part because manufacturers have gotten pretty skilled at removing the plastic from the aluminum packaging depending upon type. But it's better to produce a much smaller amount of plastic in the packaging overall than to have, and to be able to have a majority of it be aluminum, than to have the entire thing be plastic, which obviously has a much larger footprint. Next, steel. Also highly recyclable, highly reusable, and fairly non-reactive, particularly stainless steel specifically. The unfortunate element sides of steel is that it's like the production of steel is highly emitting. You might kind of like sometimes see carbon footprint calculations that look at like steel manufacturing, and its overall footprint is actually very significant. So once again, proper recycling of steel is like a really important thing to consider. And unfortunately, recycling options for steel are a little bit more limited. A lot of municipalities don't really have it as like a very accessible thing for consumers, because it is more of an industrial material that's kind of like recycled at scale in that way. So it's harder for an individual consumer to kind of like find access to a steel recycling bin, because sometimes your standard blue bin oftentimes won't accept steel components, or there's toss it out when it arrives at whatever facility. It kind of functional qualities that it has is very strong, obviously. But also it has, like, depending upon thickness, a degree of like tensile flexibility to it as well. Like it will bend before it breaks, similarly to aluminum, although it is a bit more rigid and strong than aluminum is. Yeah, there's interesting things you can do with steel. It's one of those, and obviously the quality perception for something that's made out of steel is like really high. So of these three things, like oftentimes you can find that steel has probably the largest footprint. But if your client really wants to go for like that really high aesthetic, like premium perception, steel is definitely something to consider. It can sometimes have lower weight than glass overall. So if that's a really serious consideration, then it can be advantageous in that way. Yeah, these are just kind of like overview of the hard materials. They're always generally pretty good choices because of the recyclability component of them. That's one of the most important parts is the end of life of any material. And we're going to get into much more kind of like detail of the intricacies of materials when it comes to films. So first of all, I just want to talk real quick about like what kind of an abstract you're going to be navigating when you're looking at various films for packaging. And one of the key terms you're going to be running into is laminate. And so usually when people think of laminate, they think of like laminate flooring, and they just think, oh, it's plastic. But laminate doesn't just mean literally plastic. It means a composite of different materials making it up. So you can see something that's just called a laminate that's actually just like paper and like a metallicized aluminum layer. as well as there being usually like a plastic-based kind of glue that's connecting those two. But the majority of that material is actually paper and aluminum. It's referred to as a laminate. So that's kind of like one little clarifying term.
It can be plastic though.
It can be, yeah. It just means a aggregation of different materials. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't explicitly mean plastic. Just means an aggregation of different materials. So it's always important to kind of like, whenever you see something referred to as a laminate, is to ask, okay, like what are all the material layers that are going to make that? And oftentimes what you'll find is a kind of duplicitous gesture of, they'll tell you explicitly all the nice materials that go into the laminate, and they'll kind of like not really be very explicit about what the glue layer is, because that one's usually plastic. With that said, so these things are also like very rare, very, very, very rarely recyclable. On average, if something's a laminate, it's very difficult for recyclers to separate out those layers properly, and so oftentimes they are rejected from recycling processes. However, when we're kind of looking critically at the rate at which plastic recycling actually happens, which is abysmally low in North America, but also just kind of generally throughout the world, we kind of have to ask the fundamental question of, is it preferable to have something that is technically recyclable, but 99% of the time won't ever be recycled, and so 99% of the time it will wind up in landfill or the environment? Or is it preferable to reduce the overall plastic components of a material and have it be 100% non-recyclable? And for this kind of question, I usually just frame the underlying kind of metric you need to be considering is per unit of packaging, how many grams of plastic can we expect to wind up in the environment? So if, for example, a packaging of a plastic bag for container of some food, for example, is recyclable technically, but 80% of the time it winds up not being recycled. So 100 grams went into that material, and 80 grams of it wind up on average just in landfill or the environment to form microplastic pollution. Not great. And then we consider, say, a laminate structure that only uses, say, 40 grams of plastic, but 100% of it's going to wind up in landfill or be incinerated potentially or wind up in the environment. Obviously, none of these are like acceptable conditions, and preferably we'd have better methods for disposing this sort of waste, but we're dealing with kind of the reality of clients needing to use certain materials for their material properties or to reduce cost. In those circumstances, the ideal thing to pursue is limiting the environmental pollution that's occurring. So don't kind of spend too much time considering like the abstract potentials of material, like, oh, if aspirationally, hopefully it'll be recycled. It's like, okay, let's talk about the reality of how often something is actually recycled. And on that basis, how much of the material is going to wind up in landfill on average. And so in this particular example, I'm talking about the laminate structure that uses half as much plastic only contributes 40 grams of plastic to the environment per unit of packaging, whereas the technically recyclable but much more plastic is used to produce it overall example has on average 80 grams of plastic. So in this particular case, even though one is recyclable and one isn't, it's actually preferable to go for the non-recyclable option, which is, not something that you'll usually see talked about in industry, that kind of trying to emphasize the sustainability of like a recyclable plastic, that sort of thing. Okay, let's go to the next. So these are the four kind of like general categories that I think of in terms of films. Cellulose is a little bit of a weird one because it's really not, you don't see it very commonly, but I think it's an interesting one to discuss because of the possibilities that are present with it. So probably most people recognize cellulose is the kind of the polysaccharide, so sugars that are kind of like, how do I put it? They have like so starches and glycogen, which are like the sugars that we use for like energy, are all lined up like in a straight kind of the same orientation, whereas cellulose sugars kind of like cross over, like one is facing up, then one's facing down, and then one's facing up, and one's facing down. And that means that most life can't access the energy in them to break them down. So only bacteria and fungus can readily break them down. And they make up the kind of cell walls of basically all plants. So incredibly pervasive, probably the most like by weight the most like significant sugar and like even chemical in like the world is just cellulose, because it's all plant cell walls. It is home compostable because, of course, any bacteria or fungus that gets access to it knows how to break it down immediately. It is not a new, scary, like human constructed material. It is entirely natural. So sustainable advantage is it is one of the few true home compostable materials that can be used as a film. And we'll get into the discussions of the other examples and why oftentimes the claims of home compostability or compostability in general are really kind of fairly weak oftentimes. The sustainable kind of downsides of cellulose is mainly that requires some toxic substances and chemicals to be able to produce it in the first place. So hydrogen disulfide is used in the production process. And there used to be kind of more common concerns of leaks of this material because it's highly carcinogenic. Over time, safety procedures have gotten better and better, and so you don't see those kinds of like exposures to workers as often as you used to. The kind of key thing to consider for cellulose is to look at the manufacturer of the film and check them for EPA violations on like leaks of hydrogen disulfide specifically. And that's kind of like the tried and true way of assessing whether there's like a huge burden of like causing like, harm to people. The other consideration for cellulose is that it needs to have a plant feedstock go into it. And sometimes that can be wood that is like the plant feedstock that goes into the production. And then serious considerations come of like, where is that wood sourced from? So just like all kind of bio-based materials, the key question is always, where is the feedstock going to produce this coming from, and how sustainably is it being harvested? Let's see. Yes, but if those sources are quite sustainable, then it's actually a very advantageous material, since it has a pretty decent barrier compared to other plastics. So kind of you've ever have like interacted with cellulose is most commonly kind of the conventional name we usually think of it as is a cellophane. Oh, that's actually a brand name. There's other kind of more contemporary examples you might see, things like called Natureflex, and I think there's what like Natura. So there's different very marked versions of cellulose that are being sold on the market, but it all comes down to just being a cellulose film. These used to be much more common in like packaging, but plastics are generally cheaper. So in like the 1950s, we kind of shifted over from having cellophane be a really common packaging material for like produce, and shifted almost entirely over to plastic being like the common material. You still see cellophane though, and kind of cellulose-based film packaging, like in certain kinds of things. Like oftentimes it's used in like the packaging of like tea like boxes. It's also used in like sweets. So like those kind of like wrapped like hard candies that your grandma gives you, those are usually made of cellophane. The common trend is that it's not, so cellophane's main weaknesses is that you can't heat seal it. So most other plastics you can kind of heat very to a point where they kind of hit like a what's called the glass transition point, where they kind of become melty, and so you can seal them with just like putting heat on them. Cellulose, you can't do that. It also has limitations with printing on it, because a lot of the time printers aren't familiar with using cellulose, so you kind of have to convince them that they should try to print on it and see how effective it is. That's something that you can kind of encourage by developing a relationship with the printer and figuring out whether they're willing to kind of test out cellulose and cellulose films on their equipment. Yeah.
I just want to let you know we were supposed to go into the Q&A.
Oh, by now?
Yeah.
Oh shit.
This is fine. I've told everyone we're going to extend this.
Okay.
But I just want to let you know.
Fair. Okay, I'll speed up. Yeah, that's the main thing interesting about cellophane. Conventional plastics. Obviously, no one likes conventional plastics if they can avoid them. The advantages in terms of sustainability are they are lightweight compared to virtually everything else. And they're sometimes recycled. So type 1 and 2, number 1 and number 2 recyclable plastics are somewhat consistently recycled. The rest, it's basically non-existent in terms of any kind of scale. Sustainable disadvantages. They're sourced entirely from non-renewable petroleum. Number one. Number two, there's serious concerns over the like health impacts of microplastics accumulating in the environment. There hasn't really been enough time to be able to truly understand the impact this will have, but a lot of different ecologists and like public health advocates are kind of raising warning flags of like, you know, these things are incredibly pervasive, are known to be biologically active in a lot of animals, and, you know, serious concerns that we might actually be poisoning the planet at like a very, very large scale. And we show no signs of slowing down.
Only speeding up.
And finally, the end of life of conventional plastics, like aspirate, like your ideal kind of position for it, if it's not recycled, is landfill or incineration. And both of those have serious downsides associated with them, particularly because, as we all know, kind of conventional plastics also have very readily found, just kind of making their way, particularly soft plastics, into the ocean, where they are a serious source of like a serious hazard for marine life. Sustainability goals for them. Again, it's kind of hard to argue for any sustainable goals for them because they're kind of in an unfortunate position of being a very mature product and technology. And at this point, we haven't really developed any better ways of disposing or dealing with them in a kind of like a safe and pragmatic way. People sometimes argue for increasing recycling rates, but this is fundamentally limited by recyclers themselves are businesses, and they have to take into account kind of economic considerations of plastic they receive and whether it's viable for them to take them, clean them, and recycle them, and actually have a product they can sell at the end back to other businesses. Now, often the case is they just can't, where the money they would get from selling it is less than the cost of recycling it in the first place. So in those circumstances, they are never going to take the time to properly to recycle them, and they will just send them off to landfill, even if they receive them. The functional qualities, so the reason why we actually use plastics as pervasively as we do, they have an excellent seal. They have a huge variety of various material properties that mean that they are extremely useful for different kind of industrial processes and like packaging purposes. Everyone has seen the diversity of plastics throughout their life. Like, you can just look into your home and look around you and see probably half a dozen different examples of plastic being used to form very different functional purposes. There's a reason why they are so pervasive, is because they are super useful. And that's the unfortunate thing, is despite their usefulness, they are also incredibly, and this is kind of the fundamental flaw, their durability is kind of a curse, because the durability, which makes them useful, also means that they will persist in the environment for tens of thousands of years. Yeah, kind of sucks. Compostable plastics. So this is the one people usually consider as like the ideal form of plastics. Like, the solution to the conventional plastic problem is, okay, let's make plastics, but make them compostable. Sustainable advantages: they are lightweight, and this is kind of giving the game away a bit. Sometimes composted, and really it comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of industrial compostable, which is the case for virtually all actual compostable plastics, versus home compostable. So the main restriction here is industrial compostable means that it needs to be in a facility that reaches usually 60 degrees Celsius in temperature for a sustained period of time before it will achieve the criteria that is required for it to be considered to be compostable. If it doesn't hit those particular conditions, it will never compost. And the main limitation there is 60 degrees Celsius is pretty darn hot to find, like, in nature. So you really need to have a dedicated facility that's able to reach that temperature. And the reason why is something I mentioned earlier, something called the glass transition point, which is a terminology that describes the chemical transition that plastic undergoes when it reaches that certain threshold. If it doesn't reach that point, it won't be vulnerable to attack from bacteria and like water kind of exposure that usually is what's needed to degrade generally composted materials. So if it doesn't hit that point, it isn't vulnerable to attack, and it never actually composts. Of course, most advertising you see about these things is just to claim, oh, it's compostable, when the reality is that it only is compostable under very specific circumstances, and those circumstances might actually be vanishingly rare. Other examples of this include things like all the time, compostable plastics need to be in very wet, warm environments. And so you kind of raise questions of, well, if the soil in the area is relatively dry, how often does it compost readily? The answer is no, it doesn't compost at all. If it winds up in the ocean, does it compost readily? The answer is no, it doesn't compost at all. So the circumstances in which something composts are extremely limited to highly specific environmental conditions. And we are not doing very much to ensure compostable plastics wind up in those circumstances. I mentioned earlier those questions of, like, the most important question you have to ask is, per unit of packaging material, what proportion of it will wind up in an appropriate facility? And the answer for compostable plastics generally is not very much. And so realistically, compostable plastics are going to be composted a fairly negligible portion of the time. The rest of the time, they are just as harmful as conventional plastics. Yeah, and then finally, bio-based plastics. So this one is kind of considering plastics that are generated from plant-based feedstocks. So just to clarify, compostable plastics can be generated from either petroleum or plants. Generally, these are chemically identical structures. It just is the only question is what original source material kind of or feedstock went into the production of it. So if you, for example, sugarcane is a really common one where you can put sugarcane through a whole bunch of chemical processes. Eventually, it can come out as just pure plastic. It's just chemistry. The unfortunate side of bio-based plastics is even though they kind of claim to be from a renewable source, the major limitation is where that source comes from. So in the case of, if it's, say, for example, from corn, where it wouldn't be really, where it's like heavily subsidized in the US and it's already been farmland for a long time, there's certainly considerations of food scarcity that kind of have to come into question. But the land, and this is the main issue, is the land use wasn't changed to produce feedstock for the production of the plastic. That doesn't hold true for a lot of feedstocks that go into bio-based plastics, particularly sugarcane, where the most common source for them is deforesting the Amazon rainforest or other like kind of tropical forests to then grow sugarcane or other kind of feedstocks that go into bio-based plastics. So the carbon footprint of a bio-based plastic can actually be higher than conventional plastic by like a significant margin if the feedstock for it came from deforestation. And it's really hard to ensure that the feedstock didn't come from a deforested area. And once again, these are not the sorts of questions or kind of answers that industry is going to be very willing to give you, because they have a vested interest in trying to pitch these plastics as sustainable and renewable and green, when the reality is there are much more complex questions associated with them. Yeah, that is all for those materials. I did have another section, just logistics of sustainability, but I think we're going to leave that for another time.
You think so? Can you do like a quick overview?
I suppose I can do a quick overview.
Some of my following slides I can summarize them in an email right out to everyone after.
Okay.
And it's some resource slides. So you can do it in 5 minutes. Sure.
Clearly we didn't actually clearly we didn't test the timing of this talk before we went through.
It's fine. We have so much information we want to share.
Okay. So a scale of goods transported. So the important thing here is when you order a small amount of something, it will be integrated into like an existing logistics network and usually be transported with kind of other goods going to a similar destination. So so basically any kind of complex system, they're going to be like small inefficiencies. So if you're ordering a small amount of something, it's kind of going to be like, maybe it's going to go to like point A and then B and then C and then D and then finally wind up where it's at destination at like F. And that's always kind of the downside of ordering in small amounts, is that like when you order in large amounts, there can be more accommodations towards the scale, and that can reduce the overall transport time and the kinds of hands-off that need to be made that kind of add to the footprint of that transport. Also, there's other kind of considerations like the amount of kind of packaging that's required. Is when you transport a larger amount of something, you can usually get efficiencies in having less overall packaging per like weight of the thing you're shipping. So the generally kind of principle here is like to ship as directly as possible and as infrequently as possible, since shipping oftentimes is a huge portion of the footprint of any good. Next is method of transport. So generally, you're kind of talking about three main methods of transport, and then each of them are broken up into kind of subdivisions. So there's air, sea, and land freight. Land is also further divided into rail and trucking. And within those, of course, like air is also subdivided into like certain kinds of categories of air transport. Sea is also divided into different categories of sea transport. Trucking is also divided into different categories of trucking transport. Like all these are dependent on the efficiency of the vehicle that's being used. The general trend, though, is travel by ocean is way, way, way lower impact than travel by either air or land, to the point where moving something 1,000 kilometers over the ocean will have a much smaller footprint than the last 100 kilometers it takes traveling by land and truck. So sometimes the actual like transport footprint of a good will be lower coming across the entire ocean than it would be just to go 100 kilometers further inland, depending upon where you live particularly. So if you're in a coastal city, for example, getting something shipped from like inland in the country to versus transported across the ocean would actually have a smaller footprint than coming from inland. And there's lots and lots of online calculators for determining the footprint of different kinds of transport. You can just basically put two shipping addresses in and it will spit out, and also the methods of transport, it will spit out the actual footprint of something. So it's actually very, very easy to get a decent estimate of the footprint of different kind of transport methods. And I think that it's kind of because it's such a low barrier of entry, it's reasonable to, whenever you're considering the transport of something, to just take the time to kind of consider the different methods that are available to you or a client, and use that to minimize the footprint of the transport. But generally the principle is, if you can, and the most important thing though is if you can avoid air transport, always do, because it is by far the most emitting of the different transport methods of goods. Kind of weirdly enough, one of the most emitting foods for transport is green beans, because lots of parts of the world aren't able to grow green beans like year round, and so they will be flown in, and they spoil fairly quickly, so they get flown in more than almost any other kind of like just vegetable produce. Weird
So we should not buy green beans.
Not if it's not in season and local. And finally, methods of production. So oftentimes we see kind of like food miles as like a metric that's used to determine like the footprint of a particular good, well, food specifically. But we also kind of just consider the method of production went into it. So for example, it might be actually like more emitting to get a tomato that was grown in a like heated greenhouse that was grown locally than to have one that was actually transported from a larger distance. Is one of those kind of like unintuitive things that the energy cost of having to like heat a space to grow something indoors can actually be more harmful than having to transport over a larger distance. And the kind of complexity of this is that the takeaways that there are no easy answers when it comes to trying to determine the overall footprint of a good. Transport is like a decent metric, but the complexities of just supply chains in the world mean that sometimes something being transported further, but by a better method of production, can actually have a much lower footprint than something that's produced much closer by. But that's also very case by case. So it kind of takes a little bit of personal investigation to figure it out for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Back to me now, where I will do the briefest of overviews for packaging innovation. There is some extremely exciting things happening in the world. I'm going to type more up about these things in the email, actually, that I'll send out with the replay. But there's a company called Sway that's working on creating truly home compostable plastic substitutes that are not chemically identical to plastic and are relatively inert in the environment, which is really cool. Their product isn't on the market yet, but I highly recommend you checking out their website. I'll be linking it as well as giving a little bit more detail in the email after. And then a company called Seed is actually making huge strides with their packaging and being extremely transparent. They sell a probiotic, but what's cool about their packaging is that you can see that internal foam layer that's actually holding the glass jars. It's entirely made out of mushrooms, and this is becoming more and more prevalent and more accessible as a styrofoam replacement. And again, it's entirely inert. Styrofoam is non-recyclable and super nasty for the environment. But this is actually like really sustainable and super cool. Fungi is awesome. I will talk more about it in the email. This is a slide with guidelines for choosing sustainable packaging that I will send out in the email. So don't worry about screenshotting it right now. These are, again, some more resources for packaging. We'll send them out in the email. And the last thing I wanted to do is just really quickly, if you liked this lecture style format and you found it informative, if you'd like to learn more, we did put together a full course in Corona about this with all of our information. We're really big nerds, as you can see. So there's a lot of information in the course. There's like workbooks and resource guides and templates. There's an optional certification. There's like over 13 hours of lecture content, and we keep adding to it. And there's an amazing community in Slack with other designers that have joined the course. We have tried to keep our pricing as accessible as possible. We're not really trying to get rich off of the course. We really want the ability to be a sustainable designer, to be as accessible as possible. So we don't use scarcity marketing or anything in our pricing either. The course is always available. If you sign up this week or next week, we're going to be starting coaching calls, which are kind of like the next portion of this talk, where we are supporting our students twice a week by having group calls, answering their questions about course material, chatting about sustainability things, and just having a really fun time. Those will run twice a week for about approximately 8 or 9 weeks. And so it's really, we found that students get a lot out of going through the course together in a cohort and being able to build friends and just have a really good time together. So the calls don't cost any more. It's just something that we do to support everyone. The course covers beginner to advanced materials, so there will never be an advanced green graphic design course. We'll just keep adding to this one. And we have subtitles and transcripts available for all lectures for accessibility. You can go to the link there if you're interested in learning more. There's a full curriculum with everything that we talk about. It spans from history of climate crisis to printers and paper and inks and forestry and packaging, more so than this, and the business case for green design and everything you need to know about running a green design studio and contracts, and it's everything. So now I'm going to stop talking and we shall answer questions. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our long-winded lecture here. And yeah, we'll have questions now.
Yeah, I'm just going to answer a few of the ones that were already in the chat.
Okay, perfect.
Let's see, where did they go? So I think, yeah, Lisa, you asked a question. Here in Europe, a lot of glass can't go into the bottle bank, e.g. glass from drinking glasses or dishes or candles or cosmetics packaging as a different kind of glass. That's all I know. Is it different from in Canada? Do you know what the difference is by any chance? Yeah, so generally the recycling streams for non-packaging based glass are going to be different from the packaging from the recycling streams of other kinds of glass. So for example, ceramics generally aren't recyclable in the same, well, actually, not even generally, pretty much aren't recyclable in the same streams. Depending upon where you are, there can be recycling streams that do accept things like ceramics and other kind of household glass items. Other things are kind of usually not included in that same recycling route are like window glass, windshield glass, all these kinds, depending upon areas, have their own recycling like methodologies and approaches. And if you go to recycling centers, they're the ones who kind of determine whether they're able to accept them or not, if they have like a facility that they're able to give them to. But generally, yes, packaging-based glass is consistent, has consistent like material properties that recyclers are kind of familiar with. They're able to accept them very easily. But if it's not glass that comes from like food packaging, generally, they don't know what it's made out of. So they can't guarantee that if it goes into the kind of like the inflow of a recycling facility for glass, whether it will actually spoil the batch. So they have to be much more careful and kind of take it to more specialized facilities for that. And whether those are available or not kind of depends on the area. And yeah, just because it can't be accepted though at like a kind of bottle recycling place doesn't mean it's not recyclable. It just means that maybe it has to go to a more specific location. And that's kind of the thing to ask local recyclers about.
I'll answer Amanda's question about how do you find the best local sustainable printers or printers who use more sustainable recycled paper options. It is really hard. The best method that we found is actually just creating a little email template and emailing all the printers in our area or all the printers that are around our clients. So, you know, trying to keep it local to them, and just talking about like who we are as a studio, what we do, what we're looking for specifically with the client, and if there's anything that they can offer us that is in line with recycled paper, with alternative fibers, with plant-based inks, with sustainable packaging, lightweighting plastic, etc., and just seeing what the responses are and then being able to build connections based off of that and long-term relationships. It's a little bit of a time-consuming process, but it works well, and you'll find that some printers really do not care at all, and others are really excited, and they are like really happy that someone actually messaged them about it, and they're willing to really kind of go above and beyond and give you some like amazing tips about how to be more sustainable. Jillian has a great question too about how to become carbon neutral. It's actually a really complex topic. I think we have like an hour-long video in the course about it. It's like a lot. So we also have like a guide to doing it in the course. But like the brief overview is that there's not all carbon offsets are made equal. And so it's really important to figure out which ones are best. Usually that's going to be supporting natural climate solutions like preserving forests that are slated for logging or are otherwise threatened. Another really important portion of it is just that you're going to want to make sure, especially with those natural carbon or natural climate solutions, that the indigenous peoples in the area are being consulted about, say, preserving that forest, because there's something that happens a lot, especially in the global south, is that companies will come in and say like, oh, we claimed this like stand of trees as like now a carbon offset, but the indigenous groups there are like kicked out and they're not allowed to access the land. They're not allowed to go on the land. It's like fenced off with like barbed wire and patrolled. And so that is kind of basically, as Naomi Klein says, another form of kind of green colonialism. And so we'd like to avoid that, but not all projects kind of amazing projects that, you know, fully pay off their offsetting their own carbon footprint before then offsetting to people, and are in partnership with indigenous groups and are really important to preserving mangroves and our world as a whole. That's the sort of like quick summary of like the two things to look for. Don't go for farming carbon offsets, and don't go for like methane capture or any kind of other carbon capture ones, because those are a lot harder to track how like ethical and proper that the offsets are.
Yeah. Generally speaking, there's a long history of fraud in carbon offsets.
Yeah.
There are actually many like weird and just like stranger than fiction like stories about like
companies cheating the offset
system in various ways. For example, very early on in the program, there was offsets provided for. So companies that produce certain kinds of chemical certain chemical manufacturers would, in the process of their chemical manufacturing, have like waste products that were kind of known as like chlorofluorocarbons. So those are kind of like the most infamous CFCs that are like 30,000 times more potent than CO2 for each molecule. And they would just like release those into the atmosphere generally. But then because they're so potent, they would receive credits from like a large fund that was established for kind of like
the UN.
The UN's
established
to encourage people to like to reduce carbon footprint. They would be given money for no longer dumping that waste gas and instead like capturing it and disposing of it safely. This worked up until the point that those companies realized they were making more money by like preserving the waste gas than they were from like their traditional manufacturing. So they reached a point where they would actually they didn't produce like products anymore. They just like produced as much waste gas as like the legal limit they were allowed per year, and then they would
get rid of it.
Then they would get rid of it,
offset.
collect like the maximum amount of offset dollars, and then they would just like shut down the factory for the remaining period of the year.
It's like crazy. So like, yeah, offsetting is really complicated, and there's also different like scopes of emissions that you can offset and stuff. So yeah, it's a long-winded topic.
Like, I suppose the real like kind of catch for this one is if you ever look at like the breakdown of different kinds of the different offsetting programs that were paid out to by the UN those early years, the like first 3 or 4 years, I think even longer maybe, were like 99% just those companies, because they were getting so much of the capital for those offsets because they were just, you know, literally dumping huge amounts of
yeah.
But here's the thing that's so ridiculous is that then when it was figured out what they were doing, the UN, you know, said we're not going to pay you anymore. This is absurd. And the companies were like, well, we'll just dump everything in the atmosphere then if you don't keep paying.
Not all carbon offsets are bad though. It can be amazing like awareness tool, and if you do it properly, it's a really great way of like, you know, sort of what I think really what Naomi Klein says, kind of like running in place and sort of you just really sort of like neutralizing what you're doing. But yeah, you can do it correctly, and it can be a really good sustainability tool. It's complicated.
Yeah, and yeah, generally though, like there are reputable offsetters, and like kind of there are folks who do the work of ensuring the projects that they are offsetting you with are legitimate. There's also like again, we have done a lot of deep dives into this, so there's like tons of stories, just like weird offsetting programs and carbon offsets that just like recently Shell started doing like a carbon neutral gas thing here in Canada.
We found this because I saw an advertisement.
We saw an ad for it. We were driving like home the other day, and we just were like, wait, that doesn't make sense. And I don't want to get into too in the weeds of the details of this, but I'm currently not 100% sure whether they are actually like pocketing some of the money that like, because like the cost that they paid for the offsets don't match the amount that they're actually like charging people for like getting their fuel to be carbon neutral. So I'm not really clear on whether they are pocketing the difference or whether they are losing money. And the reason why it's actually very difficult to like get the offset. You have to go into the store. Like who does that anymore? Like who goes into the store to pay for their gas? Everyone does it at the pump. So you have to go into the store to be able to get the offset in the first place. I'm not sure whether they like just intentionally trying to make it too hard for people to do, or whether they are and are people do it because they're pocketing like 1/4 cent every time that people do this.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's very, very bizarre.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have
any more questions? We're going on a long side tangent.
Because otherwise, then I think we'll probably just like start our like chatty portion. This is a good segue into the chatty portion anyway, but we want to make sure that
also someone asked about digital carbon footprint.
Oh, digital carbon footprint. Wait, where was that? Oh, I totally missed that question. Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Yeah, digital carbon footprint. One of the things that you'll find often is when you run your website, say through a carbon calculator for understanding like how much carbon your website specifically is emitting, you'll get a number. So for example, when I run my website through the carbon calculator, it says that when I adjust it from the default of 10,000 views a month down to 1,000 views a month, which is more what we get, which is actually, I think, relatively high. So 10,000 is way too high for most of us small designers. So if you adjust it down to 1,000 views per month or whatever is appropriate for your studio based on your analytics, it'll say that for us, with our website on Squarespace, we have 8 kilograms of carbon associated with our website per year. And they list a bunch of like different sort of stats about what this means, like how many cups of tea, and like it's put out to seem like this really big number. And you would think, yeah, 8 kilograms, that's a lot of carbon.
Just for reference, that's about the footprint are burning 3 liters of petrol.
Okay.
So.
Well, this is, but then when you look at the actual, so in North America, the average carbon footprint of each person per year is around 16 tons. That means that your website or our website is 0.008% of our the average carbon footprint of a person per year. Granted, I think our carbon footprint is a little bit lower than 16 tons. I think it's significantly lower than that because, you know, we try and do our best. But like, ultimately, it's a very, very, very small portion of your carbon footprint. And even if you were to purchase like 1 ton of offsetting with a extremely reputable Indigenous-backed like natural climate solution preserving a forest, that'll run you about $20 and you'll be able to offset it like many times.
Yeah, many times over.
Like many times.
Yeah.
So some of the things that one does to lower the carbon footprint of a website specifically are doing things like resizing your images and creating metadata tags and making sure it's accessible, making sure that everything runs quickly. And those are actually really just best practices for web design, which one should be doing anyway. So it's definitely something that we consider, thank you, we consider important and definitely do with our clients, but we aren't super concerned about the footprint of our website or any kind of other digital things, just because when you start considering the footprint of physical materials and even paper, it jumps so much higher and you can have so much more impact. We find that because there's so many sustainable considerations with all the choices that we make as designers, decision fatigue is kind of a real thing, and it can be hard to make every single choice about every single aspect of a project. And so we like to recognize this and focus on where we can have the most impact and be able to make the most meaningful change, because you're not always going to be able to make every single choice the right way that you wish with a client. And that's okay. You know, one of the overarching things that I always like to tell students in the course is that it's okay if your client, you know, isn't on board with everything, as long as you're starting to have a conversation and you're starting to, you know, make them think differently about things and try and get a few little wins in there, even if it's just like printing on 100% recycled paper for their business cards, or even 50%. You know, just being able to start the conversation and being able to try and make change gradually is really, really powerful. So you don't need to go from like 0 to 100%. It's about doing your best and knowing that that's okay and not feeling bad when things go wrong, because even sometimes our clients have hissy fits about things.
Yeah. I just have 2 extra points to add on that. Mm-hmm. Number one is obviously there's an opportunity cost for spending a lot of time focusing on any particular aspect of sustainability over another. And so we kind of have to consider where the areas of biggest impact are and focus on those initially and then kind of work our way down. And beyond that, there's actually, like, I think a little bit of a risk of greenwashing by fixating on carbon offsetting a website as opposed to a business. Easily imagine small business owners like, oh, it's really easy to offset my website, and then like ignoring every other aspect of their business, and it's like less than 1% of their overall carbon footprint. But then they get to say this website is carbon neutral, and then it's like, but not every other, not even anything else. Like, and it's one of those funny things where like the overall impact is so, like, it's very forward facing, so people get to see that and go, oh, it's carbon neutral, that's so great. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, like, you could offset the same amount by like skipping a burger like 3 or 4 times a year. In a year. So mm-hmm. So it's very I find it to be a risky thing to bring up, particularly with clients, because the carbon offsetting for the website on its own, I think, can be greenwashing. Because it is so negligible compared to other aspects of a footprint. Mm-hmm.
Also related to this are things like the carbon footprint of your email, the carbon footprint of watching Netflix. We've done deep dives into these as well, but the common overarching theme, especially with the Netflix one, that watching like 30 minutes of Netflix is equivalent to driving 30 minutes or something, that really got sort of like plastered all over, is that they actually had to issue a retraction because their methodology was so bad that it was entirely wrong. And it wasn't
specifically, they confused the terminology of bit and byte.
I know, right?
They thought they were the same unit of measurement when I think byte is like 8 times larger or 16, something like that.
It's significantly larger.
So based on that, they literally had like the overall footprint be like an order of magnitude larger than it actually was. Mm-hmm. And then when they did the retraction, and obviously like watching 30 minutes of Netflix is not the same as driving your car for 30 minutes. And they were like, oh, this is embarrassing.
Yeah, but the damage has already been done.
Yeah,
so you'll still
like that's such a sticky meme that like you see it like plastered in like, you know, carousels and like posts. Mm-hmm. People are like, did you know?
Thank you for coming, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Okay, that's a bit of an aside. So that's carbon footprinting in like a nutshell. Other questions if people have them. We will very easily go deep down a rabbit hole, and it's to our to our bad practices.
This kind of format is very very emulative of what the coaching calls are like. Yeah. Where sometimes we just go off talking about random stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's all related to sustainability. It's always on topic, usually. But if no one else has any direct questions, I think we'll start a discussion about how we run our studio and how we communicate to clients.
Let's give it a few minutes for.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a little tea, mm-hmm. and see if anyone's typing anything. Also, if anyone thinks of questions later, feel free
throw
to
them in the chat.
Like, throw them in the chat, or like even just email me. Like reply to the replay email. I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone that has any questions. Well, I think we can start talking.
Sure. So
running like the process of like starting. Oh, thank you, Ina. This is so sweet. The process of when I started to early on explore green design and what it was kind of like a little bit, I really didn't know what I was doing. So I knew that it was important, and I wasn't sure what I could do as a designer. And as I learned a little bit more, I started figuring out, okay, I can use recycled paper. Like I can try and like consider, how much my clients are printing. So like, especially at that time, I was working a lot locally here in the city. And so clients would be like, oh yes, I want like 1,000 rack cards. And it's like, but do you need 1,000 rack cards? Is that really necessary? You're probably going to change some information after like 2 quarters, and like 500 of them will be wasted. And so I was really trying to figure out how to navigate this space, especially when some of my clients were a little bit conservative. We do live in a relatively progressive area, but it's on an island. It's a smaller city, and there is quite a small business conservative backbone which runs through. And something that I started doing in the beginning was I was always really upfront with my clients about what I felt was important in terms of considering green impact. In the beginning, I didn't have any kind of strict policy or rules that clients had to choose green, but I was telling them that I was going to do the research and present them green options, and then they could make a choice based on their budget and what they wanted. The papers. Pretty well, usually people didn't have too much of a fuss about it. They kind of were just like, yeah, whatever, you go do your thing. And they didn't really feel that it impacted them as much. After I got more confident doing that and had some pretty good responses with that, especially people choosing the recycled stock and for business cards, say, and being relatively happy with it, then I started only presenting sustainable stock options to them. So when they were like, yes, I want business cards printed, I would be like, so there's this recycled paper option, or there's this recycled paper option, or there's this recycled paper option. And I didn't even like necessarily like tell them that it was recycled paper. I would just be like, oh, it's Mohawk, I can't even think of it, eggshell, like 110 pound or something. I don't think that stock is actually recyclable or made of 100% recycled paper, but like I would just tell them the stock and show them the stock, and not even worry about like the sustainability considerations, because I knew the ones I had picked were good, and just let them choose based on how it felt and, what they thought of it. And so that was like a really sneaky way of getting clients to like fully transition their marketing materials over to more sustainable options. And they had no idea what was going on, because they don't know. They don't know what paper stocks are out there. They don't want to talk to printers. They were happy that I was taking on the role of just doing that in the first place, and they didn't have to deal with it. It was something that was scary for them, and they just wanted nothing to do with it. And so they were just grateful that I had selected the best options as my expertise as designer, and that they could choose from that.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of like emphasize that you actually offer a lot of value to folks when you take the role as liaison between them and the printers or the manufacturers for various goods, packaging, that sort of thing. Since oftentimes like they're a small business, they don't specialize in this stuff. They don't have like a kind of committed person that does this sort of thing. And you taking on that side of work for them is actually something that they will really appreciate and value.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be also reflected, of course, in your pricing.
Mm-hmm.
And then the advantage you get on that side is that you get to help them make the best sustainable choices, even if they would not initially, kind of default just going for the cheapest option every time, which kind of is, I think, an instinctual thing for all small businesses is just go for the cheapest, cheap.
Yeah.
Which actually ends up being kind of like disadvantageous for them for a lot of reasons, because the cheapest option is cheapest for a reason. Usually it's of lower quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a lot of clients that were used to printing through Vistaprint or similar online sources as well. So they were like, oh, wow, actually printing locally on 100% recycled paper looks so much better than like my Vistaprint card that came in 3 different colors on one print order.
Yeah. And I think I want to emphasize that it's not, I don't even really consider it to be too duplicitous, because like they are really ignorant of the landscape of like printing. They see the terminology, they see the jargon, and they're just like, this is like white noise to me. There's only one thing that makes sense, and that is the price point. And that is unfortunate, and actually to their detriment, because like only having one criteria that you care about means that you actually end up making a really suboptimal decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that realistically, like designers have this really valuable role of being informed, being knowledgeable about these sorts of things, and actually being able to ensure that the decision they make is like more nuanced and like rich. And that's what, and frequently sustainability is actually quite aesthetic and quite beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
and has the added ethical and kind of like necessary, like, if we want to live in an ideal future, these sorts of decisions have to be normalized.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's, in essence, I consider it to be them offloading difficult decision-making to an expert, which is you, which is what they should have been doing anyway. And so you're just kind of like facilitating that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which I want to put a pin in the idea of the cost and come back to that. But I want to answer Lindsay's question about if I was meeting local clients in person or how I did it digitally, and whether or not I send physical samples of the papers, and did any of them care or not. So in the beginning, this was pre-corona, and I was meeting all of my clients locally, because in my city, that's how business is done, is that you meet in person or you don't meet at all. Personally, I didn't really like that ever, because we don't have a car. So I was having to bus around to a lot of places. And then sometimes people wouldn't show up to meetings, and I'd spend 30 minutes busing there. And then I had to spend 30 minutes busing back. Not very fun. Eco-friendly, but not very fun. And so I was showing them the paper stocks in person. Usually I had gone to the printer and they'd given me a little swatch book. When I wasn't able to meet them in person, sometimes I would just send a close-up photo of the stock, trying to get the texture and lighting correctly so that they differ. Also, like, spend time describing the paper stock and try and find photos of the paper stock in use. Usually you can go onto the paper supplier's website, and they'll probably have some sample projects somewhere on their social media or website just showing off the paper and how cool it looks. So that's something that I would also do, just to show clients what it looks like in use. We do all of our work digitally now, in/post-corona. We will continue to do all of our work digitally. For our larger clients, I will obtain physical samples for the papers and send it to them or have it shipped to them. Sometimes when you're doing packaging as well, you can just get a proof sample printed. That can be really great for checking the quality as well. Or they'll be able to send a swatch book or just a set of sample packaging materials, sometimes for free, sometimes for $5 to $10. So we definitely do ensure for our larger clients that they do get to see the paper stock, because that can be a really important part of the process and also pretty fun. We also get just really geeked about like sustainable packaging options. We're like, this paper, it's so good. We really want you to use it. Please look at it. And so, through that process, we can get them a little bit excited about what they're doing as well. Because ultimately, the kind of paper that they choose can be a really strong selling point for them. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, even though a paper stock like, say, Mohawk Hemp renewal line might be a little bit more expensive than 100% post-consumer waste recycled paper, the ability of them to say, hey, we've committed to this extremely sustainable paper can actually, again, drive purchasing power and consumer buy-in for the product, as well as really being able to walk the talk with their values. And that can actually make up for the margin difference on the upgrade for the paper stock.
Yeah, there's also like a lot of work that's been done kind of like assessing various demographics and their willingness to pay a premium for like more sustainable packaging. And generally the trend is, as much as a 10 to 15% like increase in cost for sustainable packaging.
Yeah, people will pay.
And that is, not insignificant for a lot of goods. I also will add real quick that the oh, actually, I had a thought, then it totally escaped me while you were talking.
Sorry.
Oh, so one important thing to consider as well is the relationship you have with your printer and the way you can leverage that to have them kind of have more sustainable options available. So printers are obviously businesses and they're trying to make decisions of what they purchase in terms of stocks based on the demand they have in the area for them. So if they don't have sufficient like demand to justify like purchasing sustainable or like recycled like paper stocks, they're not going to have them on hand. But you being someone who's coming to them with regular business, particularly if you can guarantee you're coming to them with regular business, can help them justify the purchase of those stocks, and or even make them enable them to buy the stocks at a larger quantity than they otherwise would be able to, giving them better economies of scale and therefore a lower cost that they can pass on to customers.
Yeah.
So basically, like, know your printer, talk to them about what their like buying decisions are and how like what the points at which they can make the extra effort to buy sustainable or recycled content, and then try to work out with your clients. Like, if you can say, for example, say like, okay, well, if I can just get 4 clients with like a run of like X numbers of like quantity of like a thing, then the printer can guarantee this price that they currently can't offer because they aren't able to afford like that particular like margin. But once I hit those 4 clients, they can afford it, and then I can like give people this really excellent price on their sustainable stock. And that sort of information is like totally opaque until you talk to the printer and figure it out with them. So having a relationship with your printer and like being able to and have a consistent relationship with a printer that's local is super valuable for that reason.
Yeah, and we have like relationships with suppliers too, not just for paper, but for other food packaging and other packaging solutions. And they'll send us like podcasts and stuff for like breaking news for like, cellulose or like something cool that's coming to the market. And so like they are also informing us and keeping us like
in the loop
for like cool things that come up, and like whether or not something would be appropriate for our clients, or if we've done a print run of something and something new comes in, they'll be like, hey, maybe you want to consider this new product for their next like run of packaging, super sustainable, and I think they'd be able to afford it. It's that kind of relationship that can make things less daunting and go smoother, and that's really just about being curious and polite, and making sure that like Lisa cares on the printer side.
Also kind of funny because like as much as like we emphasize the sustainability and like sustainable packaging, Emma is chiefly a designer and I'm like a dabble generalist on the sustainability of packaging. There's always going to be someone who's in the industry who's going to be much more knowledgeable and like up to date on current news, and having a relationship with them where they keep you like in like if they know that you're interested in sustainability stuff, they will think like, oh, it's good to keep a good relationship with this person because they can be regular business. I'll tap them in on like some news that I've read from an industry article or an industry website that I check regularly. And I appreciate when like some of my contacts at various suppliers do that for me, because it's like way easier to keep track of stuff through them than it is to like have like a website list of every conceivable material and packaging type that you have to check regularly.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
And then we like to share that information with y'all.
Yeah, we pass it along. We often like make the like joke to our clients that like them paying us to consult on like a certain like packaging solution is like subsidizing us then like being able to put it in the course for all of our students, so that information becomes like more accessible for everyone. So it's really nice to have that kind of like workflow. I guess I'll talk a little bit about sort of some of the downfalls that can happen with clients, because sometimes like I always use a good example for the business card because this actually happened to me, where the client, I told them they couldn't print a laminate on their cards because it's just a plastic layer, and effectively turns the business card into a single-use plastic, which like the vast majority of business cards, I think it was either 75 or 85% of them are thrown away in like 5 minutes. No guaranteed into the recycling. So I was like, no, you can't do this. Like we don't print with laminates. That's just one of our like policies. They actually went to the printer behind my back and tried to print on laminate, and the printer called me up and was like,
they won't like this.
They're doing the laminate thing. You might want to check it out. And I was like, oh, don't print that. I'm gonna be in touch with them. And so like I had a conversation with them, and so there's 2 ways that these conversations can go. Thanks for staying, Amanda. So one way is that the client is truly just they don't know. And I find that this happens the majority of the time. I would say 90% of the time the client doesn't know. And so when you start explaining the details about their choice and why it's not a very good choice, and how like, you know, it is a plastic, it turns into single-use plastic, it's going to break down into microplastics, it's probably going to be thrown away. There's no real need for their business card to be waterproof anyway. They're actually usually just shocked at that, and they don't want to make that choice anymore. And it was just because they don't have the domain knowledge. They don't know what their choice means. They just thought the shininess looked nice. Yeah. And that's where most clients are coming from, is just a state of like, they like the aesthetic of the thing. And they see a like colleague or friend has done their business cards in that way. And they're like, well, I want that too. That was cool. But usually when you talk to them, they are really like understanding and will change their mind. And that can be really good. This client, on the other hand, did not change their mind. They did not want to move from that, and they did not care. And so I had to unfortunately end up having quite a terse conversation with them, saying that like, I can't let you do this. If you want to work with me, I can't like allow you to do this, because it's going to eventually hurt my reputation. If someone asks where you got your business card design and you say little fox and it's got laminate on it, that looks extremely bad for us in a smaller city. That could ruin our business. And
it's a little bit excessive, but you throw the hard punches even if they're
yeah, like, you know, it can damage our reputation, and so we can't let you do that. And you know, they eventually didn't do that. But then the relationship was pretty much ended after that point. But I say that to say that like most clients don't react that way.
Yeah.
That's really only going to be a few clients every now and then that are super unhappy with that and then don't care to make a more sustainable choice. Most clients are really open to the new knowledge.
Yeah, I suppose I will add that like most folks aren't ideologues. They're not like aggressively like, I don't know, pro climate change in some capacity and like want to do the unsustainable thing. Folks are generally fairly pro-social and generally just ignorant of like details. So informing them and educating them on these topics can be more than sufficient to help them like, or kind of make them just make the better choice on their own. Like, of course, there will occasionally be folks that are adamant that actually they want to have more trees burned down. Yeah, we do cover.
Yeah, which is a surprising. The answer might surprise you.
Well, you mean inks that have like metallics in them or metals in them, like heavy metals in them, or you mean metallic inks that are just like shiny?
We cover both.
Do we cover both? Okay, we cover both. So either way, either way, yes.
And foils. Foils are also covered. Spot UV is covered. Water aqueous coatings is covered. That's a misleading one, often labeled as being eco-friendly. Printers on their website will be like eco-friendly aqueous coating. What it means is that technically, instead of usually an alcohol base that evaporates, it's a water base that evaporates. So there is a little bit of less emissions of volatile organic compounds that pollute the air because it's water evaporating instead of alcohol. However, the material left behind on the paper is still plastic. Yeah. That didn't change. So it's relatively misleading in terms of how environmentally friendly it actually is.
Well, it's one of those things that it implies environmental neutrality. And this is one of the frequent kind of like bait and switches you'll see. Something will claim eco-friendly, And of course that implies like environmental, like, benefits or environmental neutrality at the very least. But more often than not, what it actually means is like slightly less harmful than alternatives.
And I didn't know until I talked to a printer about it that was particularly eco-friendly, and they said, hey, actually it's still plastic. And I was like,
yeah,
the tragedy of it all. But it's that kind of insider information too, where they understand the formulations, the processes, the patents. You can also look up Google patents for these things, which is what I also do sometimes to figure out like what something's made of, is look up the patent. But being able to have that connection with the printer kind of just makes things a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Are there any other questions we've missed so far?
Yeah, does anyone have any questions, or like specific questions about running a studio or talking to clients?
Also, I'll hazard that like even a question that consists of like, I am interested in X topic, please talk more about it, are like perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be a specific question.
Yes, that's very true.
And we'll take the opportunity to like enjoy some tea.
I have a question about like writing contracts for clients. Like, do you guys in your contract have sort of guidelines for sustainability within graphic design specifically? Oh, okay.
Yeah, we do. And we actually make the client sign on it.
Right.
That's in the contract. That's never the first time they're hearing about it, though, because we're very upfront on inquiry calls about it and saying that there is a section in the contract specifically about it. It's really focused around being able to choose a sustainable solution that is at least vetted by us.
Okay.
Food packaging can sometimes be really difficult. We always bring this up as sort of like the example where you're probably going to have to make a hard choice. So you're likely sometimes in packaging going to have to use plastic in some places, and that's okay. It's, then you start having conversations about lightweighting and what type of plastic and the grams of plastic that's Aston's talking about. But even just being able to have a more in-depth conversation with the client instead of just going like, yeah, that default stand-up pouch, go for it. Just being like, well, maybe we can consider this one that has layers of like paper in it, and then there's less plastic. It's really about like enforcing the need to have a conversation about it and ensuring that we're at least doing our best. Yeah.
Right. So the contract kind of goes over like, you got to double check with me that the sustainable things are all good.
Yeah.
That's just sort of where you set it at. Okay.
Yeah.
Like an overview.
Yeah, because it's too complicated to get every single like possible sustainable choice being made.
We also have stipulations too, not just about like the printing, but like about the kind of take on and the ad campaigns that we'll do as well. So if something is contributing to like weapons manufacturing or like colonialism or like anti-LGBTQ plus or any kind of other harmful thing in the environment, it's expensive really. So that we won't allow our designs or the work that we do to propagate any kind of like negative connotations.
Well,
right.
Harm. Negative harm.
Sorry.
Yeah.
the words blur together.
Okay.
And like, cool. I haven't considered selling the contract template. It's in the course as well as the email templates.
Also,
but I haven't considered selling them like separately. Eventually, I do want to like consider selling the templates separately from the course, but we haven't gotten our like ducks in a row for that.
Also, add real quick that if we ever were to sell them independently, they would come with like a discount code for the course. So at no point would you be paying like double for the same thing.
Yeah,
that's our general policy for any supplement things we have, is if they're included in the course, they also get like a discount equivalent. Because again, pricing accessibility is something we think is really important.
Yeah, we have a webinar replay that for how to market yourself as a sustainable designer, and we've had people purchase that and then purchase the course like immediately after, and so we always refund them on the webinar purchase.
we could go at length about like the ethics of like course pricing and like course marketing, because I'm sure folks have seen a lot of like ugly models of this sort of thing, and we find it to be well, there's a carousel in the works calling out some of that stuff.
Don't get me started on the pricing of 10K courses. That drives me up the wall. We have a great question about
yeah, Angelique.
How do we manage the cost of research for sustainable solutions, and for each new project, and for small businesses that have lower budgets?
So generally it kind of goes in a few different directions. Obviously, it depends a lot on who's asking. So smaller businesses versus larger businesses, smaller price tag for a smaller business. But generally, that it tends to be the case that a smaller business also has much simpler questions to answer. So the ability to consult for them is they usually have maybe one or two very simple questions that are maybe something we already know. Usually what we do, we start with the initial consult call. We're trying to figure out what their problems are. And from there, we would usually come up with a proposal document that we would send them. And in that kind of say like, okay, well, and in that we'll kind of have a few different options. So it consists of, okay, you want these questions answered, and we'll just do those answers in like a small report, and that will be that, and it'll probably be the lowest price. If it's something that's more extensive, where they have something as abstract as like, what's the best possible sustainable option for this good that I want to sell? And if we don't have like a ready answer, we're going to have to say, okay, well, we're going to be doing research on this, and we'll be very explicit of like, this will require, a certain amount of research time from us, and the price is going to reflect that. So usually it kind of comes in the form of offering basically tiers, where we can say, if you want us to do as rigorous of a research as possible, it's going to come with a price, because it's going to be very time intensive for us. If it's something we already know, we can offer just like a very simple consulting fee on that basis and just kind of inform you about it. And if you want documentation to support something beyond just like a consult call, that will be extra money too, because we have to like build the document out and take time to formally write things up, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So really it's very case by case. The underlying principle is, things cost more if we just take time on them. So if there's going to be a, something we haven't really actually looked that deeply into, and we need to do potentially spend dozens of hours on research for something, no one's asked for something that extensive yet, but in that case,
we have like field.
Oh yeah, that's true. But what the one group that has asked for that is kind of like in a weird gray area.
Well, it was one of our first packaging clients, and so and this is something that's probably actually pretty realistic, is that we quoted them at a certain amount. We heavily underestimated how much research time it was gonna take, and so we didn't particularly get paid super fairly, but we did learn a lot, and now it's completely transferable to our other clients. It's come in very handy across the process. So it was kind of like, well, we did a bunch of research for free, but it was worth it in the end.
Yeah. And we're in the somewhat unique position as well, having to create the course at the same time meant that a lot of it was cross-transferable, and in some ways, like the contract was kind of subsidizing the creation of the course, and the course is kind of subsidizing the research, because we're able to then say we can devote more time to developing out the research and learning these things in depth, because we know we have like a ready audience for folks to be able to kind of like transfer the knowledge to, as well as being able to apply it to clients as well. So we're not dependent on just like one income stream to be able to like support the work we're doing.
Yeah, but that's also part of why we want to add all of these things into the course, is to make it a little bit easier on all of our students, so that they don't have to do quite the same level of like baseline research for like the intricacies of each packaging type. And that's something we're going to be adding even more to in the fall of the course, is like much more detail. I actually really want to create like little PDF guides to each material for our clients and for the course. So it's like, oh, your stand-up pouch was made of, this type of plastic. Here's the little pamphlet that tells you about the material, what parts of it are sustainable, what parts of it are not sustainable, why you had to choose this, and how to talk to people about it, so that customers understand why you chose this and why it is actually like the best thing that you could choose in that current moment, based on limitations of the industry, the product, and budget, and just allowing them to be able to talk confidently about their packaging solution that was selected, and have that be something that consumers can make sense of, and also what not to say about it, because especially for like say compostable packaging, you really just shouldn't be calling things compostable without clarifying what exactly it is.
Yeah.
And I think that would also be useful for the course of just like really quick guides to each material that students can even send to their clients or something. So that's what we'll be working on in the fall as well, which is a free update to everyone who's in the course or joins at any point in time.
Yeah, we're kind of committed to every time we have like a big research project of some kind to then like repurpose it for course content. We like double dipping in that way.
Yeah, the course is really like what we're like. We love working with our clients, but like we love the course a little bit more because it's very emotionally fulfilling to be able to help people and not go through the struggle that we did. And I think it's doing like ultimately more good in the world, I think.
Yeah, we have some pretty cool clients.
We do have some pretty cool clients
that are doing really interesting sustainability things.
Especially recently.
Recently. Like that's kind of the other, like, I guess, like privilege we've gotten out of putting as much time into this as we have, is that being able to kind of present this sort of information really confidently has really opened doors for certain like awesome clients who are really invested in this sort of stuff to kind of see what we're talking about, recognize the authenticity, and then like approach us on that basis.
We get most of our inquiries actually through Google of people searching for sustainable design, and that they're really looking for it. And this is really interesting because often we have a little question on our inquiry form that says, why do you want to work with Little Fox? And I love that question. It's my favorite part of the inquiry form other than budget, because it really like is like, you can tell when the clients are really interested in working with you. And we frequently get comments like, oh my God, I was looking for something sustainable and I looked at all these other designers and they just didn't have that values alignment. And you do. I can see it so clearly on your website already. I'm so excited to talk with you. And whether or not they end up working with us is another question, but it's nice to see that people are looking for it. They're searching it out and they're seeing that values alignment immediately, because that can be a huge way to win contracts and win higher paying contracts, is just by having a values alignment. Instead of competing over process, values is much easier for clients to like have that selling point and pick you over someone else.
Yeah, in part because like process is very opaque to clients. They're not industry like savvy. They're going to see just jargon and be like, they're a designer, they design, like what is there more to it?
They do strategy design.
They don't know what these terms mean, but if they see that there's like kind of like a values alignment, they're going to go, oh, well, this person cares about the same things I do. I can kind of trust them to, treat me with care, and I'm going to be in good hands.
And understand my services or my product.
And Jillian, that comment about like difference between biodegradable and compostable, that is so accurate and so like infuriating that there was like a norm for a while. Industry was like, oh, we're going to call this like oxo-degradable and like photodegradable. And it's like, so what does that mean? And it's like, well, when it's exposed to air and light, it breaks down. And it's like, okay, into what? It's like microplastics. It's like, what? Hold on, hold the phone. That for a while, that was the industry where they were considered or called biodegradable when you just didn't see them anymore. It was a very like existential sort of thing, where if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. So as long as it broke down to small enough particulate matter, it was gone.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me. Everyone thinks of like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch as like the one little area that has like the mountain of plastic, but really it's this huge. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's a really huge expansive.
Feel free, elbow me again.
I'm sorry. It's this huge expansive area that looks like mostly blue ocean, and then when you run like a special filter through it, it's just full of microplastics. Yeah. It's scary. Is it easy to find suppliers that have life cycle assessments on their facility or product?
No. Generally, suppliers are fairly opaque about that sort of thing. You usually have to find, particularly because if they're going to do life cycle assessment, that they got for themselves, they have to pay for it, and they're going to be less inclined to pay for life cycle assessments that are neutral, I suppose. Yeah. So there are businesses that specialize in doing life cycle assessments for other businesses. I don't trust them very much because there is an institutional like bias towards producing life cycle analyses that are going to be preferential to the clients in some capacity. And there's actually like a video that I have like meant to produce for a long time and kind of is in the works
Fall. We're gonna do it in the fall.
about how to critically look at like life cycle analyses. This video was put off so that I could like do a really like an hour, like, you know, those like kind of the trend in YouTube of people doing like video essays are like an hour and a half long. This was like my version of that with a video about B Corp. Oh
yeah. If you think B Corp was sustainable, just watch this 1 hour long video essay.
And we kind of want to make that one public because I put so much fucking work into it.
I know. We will.
Anyway, the life cycle analysis thing is like kind of like my next big project. Oftentimes what you kind of have to do outside of finding like a specific like supplier life cycle analysis is to look at more general analyses of the material that they're using and use that to kind of to generalize to an extent, because there are academics that do more rigorous and impartial life cycle analyses that you can, depending upon their methodology, use to get a better idea of kind of various materials and processes overall. That with that said, oftentimes you find yourself like working off of a lot of incomplete information. So you find like bits and pieces of a whole bunch of different parts of a supply chain. And then you kind of say, okay, from this, I could do like this estimate to lead to this estimate, lead to this estimate that kind of gets you like in a ballpark. And as you kind of go along, your error bars on like the final calculation kind of get generally pretty big. Again, life cycle analysis is, it's actually, it's hard. And it is also very, very prone to what I like to call just like bias-driven choices. So you can influence the final outcome of a life cycle analysis based on like kind of where you gate your starting and endpoints of the analysis you're doing. So do you consider like the raw extraction of raw materials, and how do you consider the end of life? And those, and like kind of where you kind of slant the beginning and end can really influence the final footprint of different materials. What you see a lot of the time when plastic industry is doing life cycle analysis of plastics is they will neglect the initial extraction of oil as like a raw product that goes into the production. So they just start with like plastic cullet as the footprint, and then they extend it out to the end, to the point where a consumer gets it, and they don't include anything past that point. When realistically, we're aware that the majority of the impact of these goods are end of life because of microplastic pollution, which we currently aren't even aware of how significant this is going to be towards public health, and the extraction of petroleum, which of course is highly emitting. And so if you cut those two things out, plastic looks very favorable, but obviously you just cut out the two most important parts of any analysis of life cycle of plastics impact on the environment.
Congrats on your first client project, Kate. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, my coworker is a professional dog trainer, so I'm making a logo and a business card.
So,
that's fun. That's awesome.
Yeah, exciting, intimidating, but we'll see how it goes. Yeah.
Good luck. I'm sure you'll do great.
Thanks.
Also, Ina, Diane features prominently in the video. Spoilers.
Spoiler alert. And Julian, yeah, I saw that Guardian article that came out like a couple weeks ago about like how by 2040 most people are going to need assistance conceiving. The world we live in is rough. But this is also part of why I started researching about this kind of thing, because I was scared. I was anxious. I didn't know how to like deal with it. And I found that learning more and understanding the problem more actually helps make me feel better, because I can better understand where the news headlines are misleading and when they're accurate. And it has brought comfort to understand these issues in more detail, and not sort of just like be caught in the news cycle where you don't really understand things and you just know it's bad, because that was my life for a long time. Mm-hmm.
It's actually kind of, it's one of those, this is one of my, some people argue for, rather than calling the current era the Anthropocene, the Plasticine, because like in the geological strata that will be like maybe examined in the future, but probably maybe won't be. If aliens come and find an empty planet and they're looking through the geological strata of the Earth, they will go through and they will find this one particular strata that's just like filled with plastics, and they'll go, "Oh, interesting. This civilization collapsed to like the fourth great filter of like all life. They filled the environment with with persistent pollutants that they couldn't escape. Oh well."
Yeah, I think that I think like according to like how they actually classify the layers, that one is the most accurate, because we already have the Holocene, which is supposed to be about human impact. So the Anthropocene is kind of like
a little bit redundant.
A little bit redundant. I feel like Plasticine really encapsulates it better.
Yeah. And it is disturbing. Like, I mean, part of it is that we like, so this is one of those things where this gets a little bleak.
Do we want to end on a little bleak?
Are we ending soon?
I don't know.
So I'll just launch in, because otherwise it's gonna
go for it.
You know, informed is better than uninformed, even if part of this is speculative. So we are looking at basically about 70 years of large-scale plastics production, particularly for single use, where post-World War II is when it really started to ramp up in terms of its like common consumer use. And that 70 years is one of accelerating production over the course of that time period. A good chunk of what we produced in the earliest days is what is now contributing to the microplastics that are currently around. And so a lot of what was produced post those earliest days has not had adequate time to degrade into microplastics. So we will, even if we were to stop all production of plastic like today, we're only going to see an increase in microplastic density for probably centuries past this point. Like there will not be fewer microplastics for a long time. And so if we start seeing even minor health effects now, the danger that potentially could be present in the future is that the density of these materials only get higher for a very, very long time before they start decreasing the environment again. And you know, again, the health implications are not known because we don't know what it looks like when an organism is exposed to that kind of density of microplastics. We don't know what the long-term bioaccumulation effect is. We also don't know what the ecological effect is very well. Like it's known that they are somewhat deleterious to like the health of soil bacteria. It's known that they are somewhat harmful for the health of like amphibians. And these are kind of like a canary like organisms that we use to assess like the impact on other species that are less like immediately exposed to certain like environmental toxins. But yeah, it's just it's very unclear what the long-term health impacts will be on mammals, humans, ecosystems in general.
I think the thing that's frustrating is that like you could at the businessman or industry, they know it's changing. They know things are changing. And what we're seeing is that while they're still creating new extraction sites, that's really not like slowing down too much. It is slowing down a little bit, and they're putting more of their resources into chemical plants and plastic production. And they are expecting that the chemical production or the plastics production is actually going to like increase significantly over the next 20 years. Like they are betting, they're putting their eggs in the new basket of plastics. And that's also part of the reason why when the pandemic hit in the beginning, we couldn't use our reusable bags. And it was because the fossil fuel companies lobbied government to say, oh my God, no, plastic bags have to be, they're the most safe to use. Yeah. None of those filthy cloth bags, even at that time, it was shown that the virus could live longer on plastic than cloth. And so like that became our reality for, in some places, it's still in effect. Even though it was not scientifically accurate, it had nothing to do with the pandemic. And it was just their way of regaining a little bit of control over the anti-plastic bag movement. They saw the crisis, they went in, they capitalized on it. And that's like one of the main reasons that, you know,
they push forward in that.
Yeah.
And yeah, Yeah, it's also very like I think this was either Ohio or Utah, where they implemented like a ban. They tried to like ban the ability to ban like plastic bags for cities. It's just again, it's just like, how has this become so politicized? I mean, obviously because there's a huge amount of capital and money that can be made by like promoting the production of these sorts of things, but it is very bizarre that like, yeah. Anyway, that's happening in Pennsylvania as well. Oh my God. But yeah, it is unsettling to see industries like answers to most of these problems are entirely missing the point, and are, if we even take them at face value, are insufficient for addressing a lot of the problems that are kind of coming for us. Also, for those of you who are still around, this is generally the vibe of most of these calls turn into.
They're not all this depressing.
Yeah, well, yeah, usually not. We also have, fun, interesting.
It's like a support group.
Yeah. Also, independent of the course, one thing that we host regularly is something called the Cooler Climate Collective, which is basically like a bi-weekly like discussion / like support group / just like social event where we kind of chat about things like this.
We really need to get that live for everyone because I've had people wanting to join.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of like the coaching calls, but we want to have it be just for everyone, kind of.
Yeah, public
for
facing.
people that don't necessarily want to take the course, to still be able to like have a good time and like have a support group and good conversation about this kind of thing. And we were thinking that we would just like price a one-time entry fee at like $5 or $10, not to necessarily make money, but just to as a to make sure that no like trolls come in and like totally derail the conversation.
Yeah. And also like this sort of thing, if anyone emails us and asks us to like defer the fee, like
we will defer the fee
because if you take the time to email us, that means that you're actually invested in joining.
Yeah. And it's definitely not to like, it's not for us to make money. We just don't want any like people we don't want like coming in and being like, actually oil and gas know what they're doing. Like don't you know they've invested in renewable energy?
We don't have the time to moderate that stuff too deeply. So small filter.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can do that next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it'd be a good idea. Yeah.
Questions?
I think everyone is starting to have to leave. We had everyone's time for like 2 hours, which is like, thank you everyone who stayed the whole time. That's awesome. It's just chatting with us. Thank you, Angelique. That's so sweet. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. This was really fantastic. I'll be sending out the replay as soon as Google gives me the replay link. And I'll send over the slides and I'll give more information about some things that we skipped, as well as some additional resources as well. So expect that later today. And I'll also include some links to join the course if anyone is interested in that as well. So yeah, thank you so much for coming. This was fantastic. If anyone has any additional questions, feel free to reply to the email.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.